Hello my friends, and welcome to our new series, The Swords of Africa. The continent has many different weapons, from spears to axes to bows and more, but in much of world history and popular culture as well, the sword tends to be the most romanticized of all weapons. Yet, when most people imagine a sword, the first thing that pops into their mind is either a European sword or an Asian sword. In fact, there are some people out there that don't even know Africa has swords. Well, I aim to help change this dynamic because in this African Super series of succinct sobriquet, spirited spectators shall see such a spectacularly staggering supply of specialized and straightforward, simple and sophisticated, shiny and spavine swords spanning states stretching from sea, shrubs, sapele, savanna, Sahel, Sahara, and sea again. Several of such shocking style and sublime splendiferousness seen nowhere else on this small sphere specified as Earth. Spoodly. Now, having voiced my vichyssoise of verbiage which veered most verbose, I hope it's okay with all of you that we start the series rather humbly with cultures who primarily inhabit the tiny nations of Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. I must admit that one of my previous plans was to start with a bang and detail every sword of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but despite months of labor, I still have much more work to do on this list of saber in this mammoth nation that many favor. And frankly, I will probably need multiple videos to cover such a large and diverse country. So if you're excited for the future videos in the Swords of Africa series, be sure to steady your blade and stab that subscribe button and slash that bell for notifications. And if you want to learn about even more African weapons, you should check out my friend Jabari and his channel, From Nothing, which covers all kinds of African weapons. And of course he covers many other aspects of the cultures of Africa as well. Alright, without further ado, let us begin. Our first sword comes from the Fang people, who not only live in Gabon but also in Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon. Their sword is known by two names, Ntsak and Fa. This weapon was mainly used as a status symbol, but it also was used in ceremonies as well, and of course, it was a functional sword with razor-sharp edges. Now, I probably won't detail weapon materials too often, but since this is the first sword type we're discussing, I will say that this sword, like most African blades, is made with wood as its handle and an iron blade. Additionally, like some other African weapons, this type can include the use of copper or brass for decorative elements. And on that note about precious metals such as brass being used in African weapons, it should also be pointed out that among Fang blacksmiths, as well as the blacksmiths of other African cultures, sometimes they would create certain rare and important swords that had blades that were entirely made of a precious metal such as brass, like the example you're seeing on screen now, which practically looks golden. On some specific Fang swords, one will find blades that are incised with dotted lines and crescents. Motifs like this can also be found on Fang masks, tattoos, and architecture. The sheath of this sword is also worth talking about. Surprisingly, I was able to learn the name of the sheath, which is a bomb. It can often be quite difficult to find the proper cultural name of a sword during my research, and finding the name of a sheath, well, that's even more rare. You'll notice the shape of the sheath is much different than the shape of the blade, and this happens in other parts of Africa as well. So you can't always guess what the blade will look like if you only see the sword in its sheath. The materials for making these sheaths can include wood, brass cord, and lizard skin, which would be affixed to the frame with copper nails. Said copper nails are considered a precious material, and they can also be found on other artworks of the Fang peoples as well. Speaking of the Fang, I've also learned that long ago a wooden sword or a simple cudgel would be used by the Ngil masqueraders when punishing criminals. But I have yet to find an isolated image of these wooden swords. Since the practice died out, it's possible that these wooden swords were never collected for a museum. However, in this photo, from a book called Ancestral Art of Gabon from the collections of the Barbara Mueller Museum, it shows what to me looks like painted wooden swords. The other major objects in this scene appear to be a fan and a spear. So I'm wondering if these colorful wooden swords might be reflective of what the old Ngil masqueraders would have used for their weapons. This scene, by the way, depicts dignitaries from the Bwiti secret society among the Fang people. The Bwiti, which is primarily found among the Mitsogo people, is one of several initiation associations in Gabon that have therapeutic and judiciary functions. Bwiti is entered through arduous initiation that in part involves using a powerful hallucinogenic plant called iboga. When the candidate is ready, they are allowed to learn knowledge pertaining to the nature of man, how society functions, the living world, and the cosmos. Another fascinating image that we can find in this book is a black and white photo that might be showing a sword being held by a masquerader. I'm saying that it might be a sword because honestly, sometimes in these old photos, it can be hard to be sure what you're looking at. This character, by the way, is an Okokwe mask of the Galwa people. The Okokwe are a judicial society whose masks appear at births, funerals, and initiations, and they maintain social order by embarrassing guilty individuals in public. While we're on the subject of masks, I should note the reason why I didn't go in much detail about the Fang and Ngil masks is because I've talked about the Ngil masks in other videos. Now before we move on, I'd like to show you all some lesser known Fang swords. For these swords, as well as other lesser known African swords, we will only discuss them very briefly, not due to favoritism of one sword over the other, but because there is a lack of academic information out there for quite a few swords. So there's only a very limited amount of information I can give you about some of these weapons. So for our first lesser known Fang sword, we have this nice looking rounded shaped blade with a flat top that I was able to confirm was real thanks to the British Museum. And then we have this other very similar looking blade right here that instead of ending in a flat top ends in a tri-point, and that one I was able to confirm was real thanks to the Pitt Rivers Museum. Now both of these museums only have a very surface level explanation about what these swords are, you know, materials and stuff like that. And so there's not really much else that I can tell you about these swords, but I wanted to show them to you because they look really nice. These next four swords come from a museum located in Sweden. So what little descriptions that they had on this website I threw into the old Google Translate, and here are the results. For the flat top sword that they have, the description read, Svord med slida clad med iguana skin. And the translation that Google gave me was vagina with sword dressed with iguana leather. Now, clearly there's no vagina in this picture, so that was a little weird. But I think I know what happened. The word slida, apparently in Swedish, can either mean vagina or sheath. You know, a sheath, the thing you put a sword in. But for whatever reason, Google thought that swords belong in a vagina. Obviously, this technology has not been perfected yet, but it's better than nothing. Now, despite the chuckle I got out of that, frankly, that information is still just surface level info. But luckily, the other sword, the wide tri-point blade, has a single word that actually does give us some real information. Its single descriptive word is Boldelsvard. Boldelsvard. That's a fun one to say. Boldelsvard. Anyway, that translates to executioner. So in other words, the museum seems to believe that this weapon here was used for executions. Though I do want to note that I have read before that there is some debate as to whether many of the swords that are labeled as executioner swords actually are used for said purpose. But I'll go in more detail on that when we get to a specific sword in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now let's move on from the Fang culture and see what the Kota people can show us. The leaf-shaped blades that you see before you are a fairly widespread form that can be found in not just Gabon, but both of the Congos as well. And although they are often attributed to the Kota, they are made by other groups including the Kele, Mefinu, and more. They can vary in size quite a bit. Some are small and knife-sized, while others are of substantial length and qualify as a short sword. Despite their fame and likely antiquity, not much has been written down about these things. According to the Collecties van het Nationaal Museum van Wonderkunsten in het Wereldmuseum, these blades were used as a machete. Did you like the accent? I thought it was funny. You'd be surprised how often I have to translate random European languages into English for my research. Anyway, it's worth noting that the machete can have both utilitarian uses and it can be used as a weapon. A more direct description of its combat potential is presented in the book Ijaarswerk van Central Africa, which refer to these things as war knives. Their wide dissemination among a vast area may be due to their simplistic yet refined design. Our next weapon is a very unusual sword for this list because it's not a traditional sword, but instead was made specifically to be sold. Originally, I wasn't even going to feature this thing because I prefer to focus on traditional art, but I figured it was a good conversation piece due to the fact that it still reflects some traditional African elements. For example, the first thing you'll probably notice is the wild-looking blade on this thing. Well, believe it or not, this is not the craziest blade out there, and the style that they employ is reminiscent of a traditional blade style that can be found in both of the Congos. And of course, we'll talk more about that sword style when we get to those countries. The next thing you may notice is that there's a little face on the pommel. Now, despite the fact that the website I found this on claims that it was made by the Kota, it probably was not, because this little guy is a reliquary guardian figure, and although many academic sources blanket many of Gabon's reliquary guardians as coming from the Kota, the reality is that they are in fact made by various neighboring groups of the Kota peoples. You can learn more about this by checking out my video about the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. Anyway, I'm not exactly sure which culture this pommel reminds me of most, but it could be reflective of the Obamba, Nadumu, Mahangwe, or the Mitsogo. And if you don't know what a reliquary guardian figure is, the gist of it is that it's a being who protects the bones of your ancestors, which is being held in a basket that the guardian is mounted on top of. To say it in a way that Americans can better relate to, think of it like a portable tomb, like how Americans will cremate their dead loved ones sometimes and have their ashes kept in a portable urn. It's kinda like that. Moving on to our next weapon, here is the Mitsogo saber. I don't know shit about this thing. I just know that it exists. Sometimes that's the best you can do with research. You try to find more info about something, but sometimes you just reach dead ends in your research. It's just how it is. One thing I will say, however, is that the overall form of this saber reminds me of the modern machete, and I remember reading somewhere that the machete was based on an older African design, so perhaps the Mitsogo saber might have been the prototype. But yeah, that's just random musing on my part. Our final sword of Gabon comes from the Punu people, which is in the collection of the Musée d'Épia in Paris, France. Now, before I get into the cultural details, I just want to point out that the only image available is this zoomed photo here, which doesn't even show the whole thing. It's labeled as a couteau Punu, meaning Punu knife, but I have seen many blades that qualify as swords being labeled instead as a knife in quite a few museums. And this is probably because it's technically never wrong to call a sword a knife, since swords are just big knives at the end of the day. Anyway, because this is the only photo, I decided to make my own digital reconstruction of what I assume the full-size blade looks like, which is what is on screen now. I personally feel that museums should always have multiple photos available of their sculptures, front views, side views, back views, top views, bottom views, and in addition to all that, zoomed in photos of important details, which is the only thing we really have here. P.S. some dramatic angle shots would also be good. So yeah, hopefully you can understand my frustration as a researcher when I'm limited to only one photo of an object. Having said all that, let's now analyze what's present. The most interesting thing here is the pommel. It has been sculpted to resemble a Makuj mask, which depicts an idealized visage of a beautiful woman. Although our sword's face is unpainted, most of the Makuj masks are painted white to link them with the spirits of the past. These masks play an important part in funerals and other events within the community. When they are performing, they do acrobatic dance moves on top of stilts, which requires a lot of training. Furthermore, the Makuj mask has become a sign of Punu ethnic identity, and maybe that's why it was sculpted on this sword. I'm personally wondering if perhaps the presence of the mask in this context may even grant the wielder of the sword some form of spiritual power. Alrighty, I hope you enjoyed our first video in the Swords of Africa series. And if you enjoy the art of African weapons, I hope you will also enjoy learning about the other African artworks that I discuss here on the channel. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.